question. I would say, some of it, I think, ends up being perpetuated because somebody hears, like, especially nowadays, somebody hears something in a YouTube video, and like, oh wow, that sounds so profound. All I have to do is ask this question, and in reality, no, it's just one of those really flimsy, meaningless statements or questions that can be posed by someone who is ignorant of philosophy. Now, I'm not saying in this video at all that I am presenting an argument for the existence of God, or that I am presenting the cosmological argument. What I am presenting is that if someone were to critique those arguments, that this would not be a way of doing it, because it ignores exactly what the argument is. And so it's a caricature of the argument that doesn't really exist. Nobody really defends it. And if they do, they misunderstand. And so this is perpetuated, unfortunately, and it'll probably continue to be perpetuated for no other reason other than people who conclude that who and already concluded that there are no arguments for the existence of God. This is just something they could say to brush away the fact that an argument can be made for the existence of God. In this case, that they're just short-circuiting the whole process of not really engaging the argument per se. As such, they just find themselves fighting against a strong man that does not even exist in the minds of one's opponents. I find that to be quite sad. Now, I'm not. There are very intelligent, sophisticated proponents of naturalism who would be much more intellectually honest in their approach to analyzing arguments made by theistic philosophers. And so to them, I give a lot of credit for recognizing this flaw, and some even directly pointing it out. Sometimes I weary in talking on certain subjects simply because something like this could occur, where I hear something 10 years ago. Somebody says, this philosopher said this, and then I state that, and then I just make a whole argument. Now, what's interesting is sometimes when people write books, they get really sloppy like this, and they'll just say, St. Augustine said, and they'll not even have it in quotation marks, and even if they do, they have no reference for you to check it, or it turned out that Augustine never even said it. It was somebody else, and it wasn't worded the way that they were wording it. And so they are building their whole argument on this as if Augustine was an authority, and the content's not even correct. And so bad scholarship, unfortunately. This happens and has happened in history of Christian thought. There had developed certain threads of anti-Catholic arguments where the teachings of the Catholic Church were presented incorrectly, and so mere caricatures of church teaching were being presented, and often explanations were given that were erroneous, and sometimes quotations were given that were either sourced wrong or quoted wrong, or there's just a general allusion to an author without any reference. And people who kind of get caught up into those streams, right? Those thread, that kind of thread of thought, begin to parrot and perpetuate these kinds of things. And unfortunately, it creates something brand new. Because it's not an argument against Catholicism, because it's not even presenting Catholicism. It's arguing against some caricature which the church itself would reject if you presented it. Um, and so it's not an argument against the Catholic Church, nor is it even Catholic teaching that is being presented in there. So nobody can really learn exactly what is being critiqued. So it kind of just creates this new field of pseudo intellectualism, um, this whole stream of just thought that just kind of lives on its own, and just it's never tested or changed or altered based on actual sourcing. Um, and so people who get caught up in that stream and perpetuate and parrot those things, that stuff ends up in books, and it gets quoted and requoted and requoted, and eventually a person doing research who just doesn't go back far enough, because who has time to go back 500, 1,000, 1,500 years, and you're just trying to make a point in your book, and you didn't realize that you've actually went back to one guy who quoted it and went back to another guy and you'd be like, oh, okay, it must be it must be true. This quotation must be accurate then, because it's been recycled again and again and again. 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, until you get to a writer that this person is definitely credible. But you don't really know where he's getting it, other than, he's saying Augustine said this, and so it ends up in their book that Augustine said it, even though it's the primary sources are never checked. It's never verified to be true. And so it gets perpetuated in yet another generation. So this has happened. This happens. It's not just this one case of anti-theistic tradition. There are anti-Catholic traditions, and there are other types of traditions that exist to critique something, but those who are involved in critiquing the thing are not very good at it, and so good scholarship is definitely needed for those sorts of things. It's kind of like a way to frame it today would be like misinformation on the internet, for instance. I think that would be a good way of kind of framing it. A bad piece of information gets worded wrong, and then it's just tweeted and retweeted, and pretty soon hundreds of thousands of people are thinking this thing, and it's not even true. This happens in the world of politics all the time, and it just becomes propaganda, news stories being spun a certain way, quotations taken out of context, and a lot of times when you really dig down deep, you find out that what the person you're being told said this or said that actually had a context to it where they were saying the opposite. So there are many examples of this, definitely during the time of the Trump administration and the attacks upon him. So I think part of it comes from an uncharitable approach to critiquing others. As I'm fond of telling people, you should radically love people. You want the best for them, right? You don't have to agree with their ideas. You don't have to accept their philosophy. You don't have to accept any of those sorts of things. We should critique those things, right? We should drag those things kicking and screaming into the light and analyze them publicly. We should have a discussion, right? Open dialogue and a free exchange of ideas, and let the bad ideas be seen for what they are, and those who are intellectually honest and actually have a certain an ability to be able to sift through such things, um, we'll be able to gravitate towards the better arguments by seeing them debated publicly. But I think most people, they just on social media, they just keep scrolling. They keep scrolling. Oh my goodness, they said what? And it keeps scrolling. And then you're telling your uncle, you're calling your friends, and like, hey, did you hear about such and such? It just becomes, it's just sloppy, is what it is. And sometimes it's not out of malice. Sometimes it's people just want to have some sort of argument against something, and this is all they know at the moment. But there are cases where there is a kind of intellectual dishonesty. Where I've had a couple conversations with people about Catholic teaching, and somebody came to me and I've shared this story before, but I asked someone who was a Lutheran, you were a Catholic before. What were some of the things that led you away from the Catholic Church? Like, well, what kind of problems did you think you saw? And they said praying for the dead was one of those things that disturbed them. And I said, that's kind of interesting, because and then I wrote this lengthy email response demonstrating from primary sources that Jews prior to the time of Christ, at the time of Christ, and Christians after the time of Christ prayed for the dead. And I remember being so proud of myself. I spent time digging into primary sources and doing the work of scholarship and putting my thought together. And after I sent it, I received. Now, this thing was long enough to be a good 5-minute read, right? It was an article length presentation of this idea and historical, laid out in a historical schema, and like 30 seconds later, I get a response from the email saying, just because people have been doing it since the Middle Ages doesn't mean we should be doing it now. It was a complete dismissal, right? I said nothing in the article about people only beginning to do this during the Middle Ages. It's just a complete inability to listen and engage the ideas of others. If I'm quoting primary sources. Now, if you want to say, well, I question the historians, I think Josephus has a tendency to exaggerate certain things, and here are some examples that are brought up among, some historians that specialize in Josephus and his literature and others there. No, none of that. Of course not. No, it's just, no, I'm just not going to read this because it just can't be true. It just can't be right. So I always had difficulty with that, because if somebody presented something to me, I'd be willing to read it. I'd be willing to take a look at it, to examine it, because that's the intellectually honest thing to do. If it didn't have a leg to stand on, then fine. I'd be like, hey, this doesn't really quote anything, and I don't know. I just look at that stuff sometimes, and I'm like, maybe it's laziness. Some people don't have time. Not everybody's has a scholarly mind, and the time, and even the interest to recheck a quote for 5 hours, and like in a library, and going over like 50 books, trying to pin down the original source, the primary source. Sometimes people are satisfied with just quoting secondary sources, or that quote things, or even worse, just paraphrases of things, And it's that sloppiness that's a problem. But not everybody has the time and the interest, or even the intellectual capacity, I should say, to formulate certain questions that really do require answers if one were to work towards a cogent worldview. If somebody were to pose to me an objection, you know, it's only going to deepen my understanding of the thing that I already accept if I were to examine it. And hey, you know, maybe the objection is correct. Or at least maybe it helps me refine my idea. You know, maybe I'm overly generalizing with a certain principle, you know, and I need to be more nuanced on the idea, because the objection is fair to an extent, and so, you know, I need to be honest with myself about that. And some people aren't willing to self-examine themselves in that way, you know.